שלום לכם. אנחנו רגילים כל כך לביקורת שמדענים מטיחים בעיתונאים המסקרים מדע, שהם מפספסים את הנושאים הכי חשובים לקיומנו כאן על כדור הארץ, שהם מוציאים דברים מהקשרם, שהם לא מבינים מספיק את הנושא עליו הם כותבים, שהם שטחיים ודורשים שורה תחתונה ברורה כשאין כזו, אבל את הביקורת הכי רצינית אנחנו לא שומעים. שהם חיוביים מדי, שהם מסקרים מדע כשורה של הצלחות, כמו חבורת מעודדות עם פונפונים, שמתלהבת בכל פעם שהמדע קולע סל. זה לא התפקיד של עיתונאים בחברה שלנו. עיתונאים אמורים להתריע ולשמור עלינו מפני תאוות השררה והתנהגות לא אחראית, לחשוף שחיתויות ובזבוז כספי ציבור, לא להיות שופר להודעות עיתונאות של האוניברסיטאות. כדי לחשוב על התפקיד הזה של תקשורת המדע, אני שמחה לארח היום את דבורה בלום, ראש התוכנית לעיתונאות מדע ב-MIT, ומו"ל כתב העת אנדארק, וכדי שנוכל לשוחח אני אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. I'm delighted to have with us Deborah Bloom, science journalist, journalism professor, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and co-editor of A Field Guide for Science Writers. She is the director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT, where she launched the award-winning science magazine, Undark. Shalom, Deborah. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
In an editorial for Science magazine, you wrote, "The most important contribution of science reporters is to portray research accurately in both its rights and its wrongs." Is it possible for science reporters to criticize science in the same way that journalists in other fields do? Does this require prior knowledge and an inside understanding that they simply don't have?
That's a great question, and I hope so. I mean, when we're doing our job, if there are issues that need to be criticized, I hope we do that and do that well. So, just looking at science journalism for a minute, it's journalism, right? It doesn't live in a different world, and it needs to have that same, this is what I believe anyway, that same sense of independent inquiry, of illuminating other rooms, but not necessarily being in the room. A good journalist, loyalty is to his or her readers or listeners or viewers, it's not to her sources. So, in the matter of science, and I made some of these points when I wrote the essay for Science magazine, I think science journalism went through a period where journalists were kind of awed by scientists, and that bought into a kind of popular conception that scientists are somehow smarter than the rest of us, right? Smarter than the rest of us, more objective, dedicated, unbiased truth seekers, which is, of course, what we want any human enterprise to be. But the fact of the matter is, science is a human enterprise. At its heart, it is just people trying to understand the world around us. They might use different tools than you do or I do, but that's what science is. It's people trying to understand the world around us. And so what makes science journalism so interesting is that you also have an opportunity to try to explain to what they're finding about the world in which we live. Science makes the world more interesting. It requires some special knowledge, but it more than that requires an ability to describe clearly and in a way that is not full of jargon and in a way that is able to show how fascinating it is. You do not have to be a scientist to cover science. You do have to not be awed. You do have to cover it remembering that it is a human enterprise, other people trying to understand the world around us. And like any other human enterprise, it's full of brilliance and generosity and ego and spite and all of the things that characterize every human enterprise. So if we don't cover it like that, then we failed at our job.
Hmm. So
That's a long answer, but I feel very strongly about that.
Well, I think it's really important to remember that. And talking about failures, often the media creates false balance in order to create conflict. Example that we always see is like having an anti-vaxxer in a conversation with the immunologist, for example. What do you think is the best way? Yeah, the best way for science writers to balance giving the full picture, so not just giving what the scientists say, but giving the full picture, but also representing of what is perceived to be expert views.
Yes, that's a insightful point, and it's something that in the community of science journalism itself, we've talked about and struggled with for years. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to go backwards a little bit in history
Please do.
to, let's say, the late 20th century, the 1990s, when climate change first began really becoming part of the international conversation. And I was a newspaper reporter then in California, so I remember this period really well. And I came to believe in the early 1990s that climate change was real. And I believed that because I was doing a lot of weather reporting and climate reporting in the state of California, where water is everything, right? So you really had to pay attention to what meteorologists were telling you about the water supply. And all the, what I'm going to call the bench meteorologists, not the big popular public figures, but the people working, they totally had accepted climate change as real, and they were using it to make their water forecasts, starting probably in the early 1990s. And I just had this moment of realization as a journalist that this was not like a political thing. This was science telling us that something real was going on. And these were scientists using that information to do better weather forecasts and seasonal and all the other meteorology things. However, journalism has long followed a political model in which there's always two sides. I'm using the United States, the right and the left, the Democrats and the Republicans. There's always two sides to every issue. And if you look at the model of political reporting, which has been the dominant model in journalism, that's the way people tend to sell stories. On this side, there's this politician. On the other side, there's this politician. And you provide the both sides, the theoretically objective balance. And what we learned in climate change, in particular, is that doesn't work in science, right? Because there's not equal sides. I'm not sure there's always equal sides in politics either, but in science, for sure, you can have differences of opinion, but the weight of the evidence, the weight of the scientific consensus is usually much heavier on one side, as it was with climate change. And so when we were doing, there's always two sides to climate change, and you would interview people who were meteorologists like I was describing, and then there were a handful of scientists, usually paid, in fact, always paid by the oil and gas industry in the United States, and you would interview them as the other side, and the journalistic model required you to present this as objectively equal, which was dishonest, right? Dishonest on the face of it, and almost and very difficult to break out of, given the history of journalism, and did everyone a disservice, right? Because for years and years and years, you had journalists presenting the either or picture of science journalism when that was not really the truth. And we've talked a lot in my profession about the fact that we failed. Again, our readers and viewers and listeners, we failed science, but we failed, providing information to the public that was an accurate description of what was actually going on. So the model that I use now is that I do a lot of research. I mean, journalists should do a lot of research anyway, and in science journalism, maybe a little more so. But when I am doing a story, I do a lot of research trying to figure out where the consensus is. Where does the body of evidence lie? Who are the people, not the big political voices, but who are the people actually in the field who are working on this and being cited by others? And where does the weight of the evidence lie? And so I'll make that decision myself as a journalist. I did that. I used to write a toxicology column for the New York Times called Poison Pen. And when I would write about particular toxic elements and exposures, I would just spend a couple of weeks doing nothing but going through the scientific literature and trying to figure out what we really knew and where the consensus was. And if I felt that industry did not have anything meaningful to add to this, which happened a couple of times, then I would just acknowledge that industry disagreed, but I wouldn't go out of my way to say, and here's the science side and here's the industry side. And this approach is right. It's accurate, it's fair, puts a burden on the science reporter to do the work and get it right.
Mhm.
It annoys people like anti-vaxxers, say,
Mm.
because any good science journalist will tell you that the weight of the evidence is that one, vaccines were one of the great public health successes of the 20th century. They've prevented millions of illnesses. There are always side effects, but they are safer than the actual diseases by thousands of times fold if you looked at something like, or millions even, if you looked at something like COVID-19. And that's where the scientific consensus is. And the anti-vax objections to that are political and cultural and social, but they're not science. And I'm not budgeable on that point. Consensuses change and knowledge changes. And we certainly saw that during COVID-19, where early on there was a lot of, how does it spread? Is it aerosolized, or, are we worried about viral droplets on surfaces? And people were like wiping down their groceries with antiseptic wipes and really freaking out about the touch thing. As we learned more about the virus, it became much more obvious that this is an airborne transmission and that viral droplets on surfaces were not a huge risk. And so that's a shifting consensus. So the other thing that is really important, if you're a science journalist, is to remind people in some way or another that, scientific knowledge is a process. It's not a breakthrough. A paper is not an endpoint where the consensus is going to shift. I think we misrepresent science too if we continually act as if now we have all wisdom and knowledge at our hands, because we don't. We're always learning.
Well,
Again, long answer, but it's a wonderfully complicated area.
indeed. So thank you for reminding us that we're always learning, and thank you for helping us to learn. And I thank you, Deborah Bloom, so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me here.